He was 6 feet tall and 230 pounds of thick, frightening muscle. Dave Draper's physique looked like it belonged to a different decade. While other champions of the 1960s posed with classical lines and grace, Draper walked on stage with shoulders that seemed armored, a chest built like a barrel, and arms that held their shape even at rest. Competitors whispered about him. Fans stared. Magazine editors couldn't stop putting his face on covers. But the most unsettling thing about Dave Draper wasn't his size. It was his silence. He never boasted. He never performed. He just trained, early in the morning, alone, in dark basement gyms where the only sound was iron hitting iron. That quiet discipline created one of the most intimidating physiques the golden era ever saw. You're about to discover how a shy kid from New Jersey became the Blond Bomber, why his training philosophy scared rivals more than his posing ever did, and what he knew about strength that most people still don't understand today. Dave Draper was born on April 16, 1942, in Secaucus, New Jersey. He wasn't the kid who played team sports or chased popularity. He was the one who disappeared into basements and garages, building makeshift weight sets out of concrete and pipe. By age 10, he'd already started lifting. By 12, he was completely hooked. This was an era when almost nobody trained with weights. Coaches thought lifters were stupid or egotistical. Society looked at bodybuilders with suspicion and mockery. 99 out of 100 coaches gave weight training a thumbs down. Parents warned their sons that lifting would make them slow and muscle-bound. Doctors said it was dangerous. But Draper didn't care what people thought. He had iron, and iron didn't judge. He spent hours alone in his basement, pushing and pulling those homemade dumbbells, creating patterns of movement that felt natural to his body. There were no instructional videos, no personal trainers, no internet forums. Just a kid and some weights, figuring it out rep by rep. His inspiration came from an unlikely source. Local dock workers named Anthony Petrowski and Tony Napierski had thick, powerful arms from years of hard labor and simple lifting. They ate basic food, worked brutal shifts, and somehow carried muscle that looked carved from oak. Young Draper watched them and understood something important. Strength came from consistency and honest effort, not from secrets or shortcuts. He built his own weight set in the basement, using whatever materials he could find. The weights were ugly and uneven, but they worked. He'd spend entire afternoons down there, alone, experimenting with different exercises until his arms burned and his chest ached. Nobody cheered for him. Nobody tracked his progress. Nobody even understood what he was doing. But his body was responding. His arms grew thick from endless curls and presses. His back widened from makeshift rowing movements. His shoulders rounded out from overhead, work done with crude barbells that bent under the load. By high school, people in his neighborhood started noticing. They'd see him walking down the street and whisper, "That kid's too big. That kid's too strong. Something's different about him." But Draper never explained himself. He just kept training. He wrestled in high school. He did gymnastics. He swam. But none of those sports felt like home the way the weights did. Wrestling had coaches yelling and opponents staring. Gymnastics had judges scoring and audiences watching. Swimming had timers clicking and teammates depending on you. The weights just sat there, waiting. They didn't care if you won or lost. They didn't judge your form or criticize your technique. They only cared about one thing. Did you show up and do the work? Draper showed up every single day. While other kids were out chasing girls or playing cards or smoking cigarettes behind the school, Draper was downstairs with his iron monsters, building something nobody could see yet. His physique was exploding before he even understood what bodybuilding meant. He didn't know about Steve Reeves or Reg Park or the growing muscle magazine industry. He just knew that lifting made him feel powerful and calm at the same time. It gave him control in a world that often felt chaotic. And that control, that quiet mastery over his own body, would become the foundation of everything he'd eventually build. By his late teens, Draper's physique had outgrown New Jersey. His size was attracting attention from people who understood what muscle could mean in the emerging bodybuilding industry. Joe Weider, the man who built bodybuilding into a business and a lifestyle brand, heard about this quiet blonde kid who looked like a Nordic god dropped into working-class New Jersey. Weider had an eye for marketable physiques, and Draper was exactly what he needed. Big, blonde, handsome, and built like a statue. Weider hired him as a shipping clerk at the Weider Barbell Company in New Jersey. Draper was 21 years old, still awkward around people, still more comfortable with iron than conversation, but his physique spoke louder than words. In 1962, he entered and won Mr. New Jersey. The title confirmed what everyone already knew. This kid was going places. 6 months later, Weider made his move. He brought Draper to Santa Monica, California, to work for the West Coast operation. The plan was brilliant from a marketing standpoint. Turn this shy East Coast lifter into a West Coast icon. Give him sun, sand, beach, and endless magazine covers. Call him the Blond Bomber. Make him the face of California muscle culture. Sell the dream of transformed bodies and transformed lives. But there was a fundamental problem with that plan. Dave Draper didn't feel like a beach boy. He felt like a serious lifter who happened to have blonde hair and a jaw that photographed well. The image Weider created, the carefree surfer with massive muscles who lived for sun and fun, didn't match the man inside at all. Draper was introverted, thoughtful, and deeply focused on the work itself. He wasn't interested in being a poster boy. He was interested in becoming the best lifter he could be. While Weider's magazine showed him smiling on Venice Beach with a volleyball or posing near the ocean at sunset, Draper was spending his real hours in a place called the Dungeon. This was a dark basement gym at 4th and Broadway in Santa Monica, a large, awful space dug out of the ground with low ceiling, rough concrete walls, and basic equipment that had seen decades of heavy use. It was perfect for someone who wanted to work without distraction. No mirrors to pose in, no windows to let in flattering light, no casual gym goers stopping to chat or ask questions, just serious lifters doing serious work in near silence. The air smelled like iron dust and old sweat. The plates clanged when you loaded them. The bars bent under heavy weight. This was Draper's real home in California. He'd show up at 6 in the morning, sometimes earlier. The sun hadn't risen yet. The beach was empty and cold. Most people were still asleep. But Draper was wide awake, walking into the dungeon with a cup of coffee, maybe a can of tuna, and a protein shake that tasted like dirt mixed with chalk. That was breakfast. Then he'd lift for the next 2.5 to 3 hours. No music played in the background. Nobody cheered between sets. Nobody filmed anything for promotional purposes. It was just Draper, the iron, and the quiet rhythm of breath and effort. He'd warm up slowly, feeling his joints loosen and his muscles fill with blood. Then he'd start working. Bench presses with 300, 320, 335 pounds for multiple sets. Wide grip pull downs with 200, 215, 225 pounds, pulling the bar down to his chest with control force. Barbell rows with weights that made the bar sag. Overhead presses, both in front and behind the neck, loading his shoulders until they burned. Dumbbell work for chest and delts, supersetting different angles to hit every fiber. His training logs from 1964 and 1965 still exist, and they reveal something most people never saw behind the magazine covers. Draper trained 6 days a week, often going 2 or 3 weeks without taking a single rest day. He used a 2-day split repeated 3 times weekly. Day 1 was chest, back, and legs. Day 2 was shoulders, arms, and forearms. Then repeat again. The volume was staggering by any standard, even today. 14 to 20 sets for chest, 15 to 20 sets for back, 10 to 15 sets for thighs, 10 sets for calves, 18 to 25 sets for shoulders, 15 sets each for biceps and triceps, then more for forearms, because Draper believed strong forearms were the foundation of strong arms. He wasn't just building muscle. He was building a machine designed to withstand years of heavy use. His bench press sessions were brutal. He'd start with a warm-up, then pyramid up to working sets with 305 to 335 pounds, repping them out for sets of 6, 7, 8. When he could hit 8 reps on all 5 sets, he'd add weight and drop back to 6. Progressive overload, done systematically, Week after week, his pull-down sessions reached 225 pounds from multiple reps, his lats spreading wider with each controlled pull. His wrist curls used 155 to 165 pounds, his forearms gripping the bar with an intensity that made other lifters stop and watch. These weren't numbers you saw in the 1960s. These were numbers that belonged to a future era of bodybuilding, when mass and density would replace classical aesthetics. And he did it all in silence. He later described his preparation for the 1965 Mr. America contest, using words that became legendary among those who understood what real training required. He called them private, unmitigated early morning workouts, silent, undistracted, and unrelenting. There was no hype, no theatrics, no gym selfies or training partners shouting encouragement. Just systematic progression and brutal consistency applied day after day, week after week, month after month. That's where the real fear came from for his competitors. Anyone could see his physique on stage. The massive shoulders, the thick chest, the carved arms. But they couldn't see the hours that built it. They couldn't see the discipline that woke him up before sunrise. They couldn't see the mental focus that carried him through 3-hour sessions when most lifters quit after 45 minutes. They couldn't see the systematic rep schemes and the careful progression and the refusal to compromise. All they saw was the result, and the result looked impossible. It looked like someone had cheated, taken shortcuts, found secrets. But the only secret was that there were no secrets. Just work, just silence, just iron. In 1965, Dave Draper stepped on stage at the Brooklyn Academy of Music and won the IFBB Mr. America title. He was 23 years old and weighed 230 pounds. He dominated the tall class and took the overall championship. The crowd sat in stunned silence when he hit his front double biceps. His shoulders were massive, rounded like boulders that had been carved and polished over centuries. His chest was thick and full, with deep upper pec development that made it look like he was wearing armor. His back was wide and dense, with Christmas tree detail in the lower lumbars and thickness in the mid-back that came from years of heavy rows and weighted chins. His arms were big, thick through the biceps and triceps, but his forearms were what people really noticed. Even other champions envied them. They were massive, veiny, and powerful looking, the kind of forearms that suggested real, functional strength. His legs were strong and proportionate, built from front squats, sissy squats, and hack squats done with relentless volume and perfect form. He had a V-taper that foreshadowed the physiques of the 1970s. He looked like someone had taken a blueprint from the future and dropped it into 1965. Fans couldn't stop staring. They'd never seen this combination of size, density, and aesthetic structure in one package. Photographers couldn't stop shooting. His blonde hair and blue eyes made him look like a California dream, but his physique belonged to a harder, more intense reality. Magazine editors couldn't stop using his image. Weider plasters him across Muscle Builder, Muscle and Fitness, and every other publication in the empire. The Blond Bomber becomes the face of West Coast bodybuilding. But Draper himself? He just wanted to get back to the gym. The applause made him uncomfortable. The attention felt strange. He'd spent his entire life training alone, in quiet spaces, where nobody watched and nobody judged. Now suddenly everyone was watching. Everyone was judging. Everyone wanted a piece of him. He did interviews he didn't want to do. He posed for photos he didn't enjoy. He smiled for cameras when all he wanted was to be left alone with his weights. But this was the price of success in bodybuilding. You couldn't just be great. You had to be visible. You had to be marketable. You had to play the game. The next year, 1966, he won the IFBB Mr. Universe, cementing his status as one of the world's top bodybuilders. In 1967, he competed in the Mr. Olympia and placed fourth, losing to Sergio Oliva, who was simply in a different stratosphere of development. By 1970, Draper won the IFBB Mr. World title, taking the tall class and overall championship. He was one of the biggest stars in bodybuilding. His face was everywhere. His physique was the standard others measured themselves against. Hollywood came calling. He appeared on the Beverly Hillbillies in an episode called Mr. Universe Muscles in playing himself. He showed up on the Monkees, bringing his massive physique into the colorful, chaotic world of 1960s television. He appeared on Here Come the Brides and other popular shows. He hosted a program called David the Gladiator on KHJ Channel 9 in Los Angeles, introducing sword and sandal movies to afternoon audiences. He acted in films like Don't Make Waves alongside Sharon Tate, playing the kind of muscle-bound character Hollywood always needed for beach movies. He had everything the sport and the entertainment industry could offer: fame, recognition, magazine covers, movie roles, money, opportunities. But something inside him was shifting in ways nobody could see from the outside. The spotlight felt heavier than the weights. Fame challenged his introverted nature in ways that constant heavy training never did. He was never someone who craved attention. He was someone who craved the work, the process, the quiet satisfaction of finishing a brutal leg workout, and knowing you push yourself to the absolute limit. And now the work was being overshadowed by the image. Fans adored him, but they adored the Blond Bomber, the character Weeder had created. The industry needed him, but they needed him as a symbol, a marketing tool, a face to sell magazines and protein powder. Draper was starting to feel the pressure of being a symbol instead of a person, of being famous for how he looked instead of who he was. Behind the calm expression and the perfect blonde hair and the flawless poses that judges loved, something else was building. A pressure, a weight that couldn't be measured in pounds or lifted with perfect form. Here's what most people didn't know about Dave Draper, what they couldn't see in the magazine spreads or the television appearances. His silence wasn't just personality, it was protection. Training wasn't just his passion. It was his refuge, his therapy, his way of making sense of a world that often felt overwhelming. The iron was the one place where everything made sense, where effort equaled results, where nobody demanded anything except honesty and consistency. Draper struggled with pressure in ways he rarely discussed publicly. He struggled with anxiety that came from being constantly watched and judged. He struggled with the weight of being a public figure when all he wanted was to be a lifter, a regular guy who happened to be really good at building muscle. This wasn't weakness. This wasn't failure. This was humanity. He carried the stress of fame, the isolation of being on display, and the challenge of living up to an image that wasn't fully him. The dungeon, with its dark walls and clanging plates and musty air, wasn't just where he built muscle. It was where he found peace, where the noise in his head quieted down, where he could breathe. Every rep was a conversation with himself. Every set was a way to quiet the external demands and reconnect with something real and true. His discipline wasn't about dominating others or proving he was better than the competition. It was about surviving his own mind, managing his own stress, finding a path through the chaos of fame and expectations. The early morning sessions, the silent focus, the refusal to make training a performance, all of it came from a deep need to keep something pure, something that belonged only to him, that couldn't be marketed or photographed or sold. That's why he could train for 3 hours without talking to anyone. That's why he could walk away from the spotlight later without regret, because the iron didn't care about his image. It didn't care about magazine sales or television ratings or how many fans recognized him on the street. It only cared about his effort, his focus, his willingness to show up day after day and do the work. And in a world that wanted to turn him into a product, that honesty was everything. After his 1970 Mr. World win, Draper started stepping back from major competition. He was only 28 years old, still in his physical prime, still capable of winning titles. But he sensed the sport was changing in ways that didn't align with his values. The personalities were getting louder. The physiques were getting more extreme, pushing past aesthetics into pure mass. The business side was taking over from the art and discipline he loved. He felt the shift happening, and he made a choice. He chose to walk away while he still loved the work, before the sport could turn into something he resented. He continued training, of course. He never stopped training, but he stopped chasing titles and trophies and magazine covers. He stepped back in the public eye and tried to figure out what his life looked like without the constant pressure of being the Blond Bomber. But life outside the gym had its own battles, harder in many ways than anything he'd face on stage. In the late 1970s, Draper struggled with alcohol dependency. The pressure of transitioning from champion to regular person, the isolation that came after the spotlight moved on, The challenge of finding purpose when your identity had been tied to your physique for so long. It all caught up with him. He made mistakes. He struggled. He disappeared from magazines and public appearances for a time. Fans who'd followed his career wondered what happened to Golden Boy from Venice Beach, the man whose physique had defined an era. Some thought he'd retired and was living quietly somewhere. Others assumed he'd moved on to business or Hollywood. Very few knew the truth. He was fighting a different kind of battle, one that required a different kind of strength. But here's where Dave Draper's real character showed itself. The character that had been there all along beneath the muscles and the magazine covers. He didn't give up. He didn't quit. He applied the same discipline he'd used in the gym to rebuilding his life outside of it. By 1983, he achieved lasting sobriety, a victory that mattered more than any trophy he'd ever won. He returned to the iron with a new philosophy, one shaped by experience and hard-earned wisdom. He wasn't chasing mass anymore. He wasn't training to impress judges or win titles. He was training for health, for function, for wholeness, for the joy of feeling strong and capable, for the mental clarity that came from consistent physical effort. He moved to Santa Cruz, California, a quieter place than Los Angeles, a place where he could breathe and think and be himself. In 1988, he married Larisse Sutherland, and together they opened world gym locations in Santa Cruz and Scotts Valley. He became a local businessman, a mentor to younger lifters, a quiet presence in the community who never talked about his past unless someone asked. The man who once terrified competitors with his physique now taught beginners how to squat properly and encouraged middle-aged people to stay consistent with their training. That's when Dave Draper became something even more valuable than a champion. He became a writer. He became a thinker. He became a philosopher of training in the truest sense. In the 1990s and 2000s, he wrote several books that would become classics in gym literature. Brother Iron. Sister Steel was a collection of essays about training, nutrition, and life, written in a style that was warm, humble, and deeply reflective. He wrote about technique and basics, about why squats and deadlifts and overhead presses mattered, about how to structure a program for long-term progress instead of short-term gains. But he also wrote about life, about dealing with setbacks, about staying consistent when motivation faded, about finding meaning in the daily grind of showing up and doing the work. He wrote with humor and self-deprecation, comparing himself to a crumbling old building that needed constant maintenance to stay upright. He said there were no secrets in bodybuilding, no shortcuts or hacks, only principles and consistent application over months and years and decades. He ran a website called Iron Online and wrote weekly newsletters for years. Long essays that combined training advice with personal stories and philosophical reflections. Lifters from all over the world read his words and felt like they were sitting across from a wise uncle who'd seen everything, done everything, and survived everything. Arnold Schwarzenegger respected him deeply, calling him one of the most genuine people in the sport. Frank Zane admired his physique and his approach. Younger generations who'd never seen him compete discovered his writing online and realized that the golden era wasn't just about posing routines and magazine covers. It was about thinking, about approaching training as a practice, discipline, a way of life. Draper taught people how to lift with intention, not just intensity, how to eat with discipline, not deprivation, how to approach training as a lifelong practice, not a temporary obsession designed to impress others. His writing was simple, direct, and honest. He'd mix detailed training advice with broader life philosophy, drawing parallels between lifting heavy weights and carrying heavy burdens, between progressive overload and personal growth, between the discipline required to show up at the gym and the discipline required to show up in life. One of his most famous lines became a mantra for thousands of lifters. Moderation assures mediocrity. The intense rule, the mediocre follow. Another one cut straight to the truth. You will train always for 100 terrific reasons. Quit, and it will be for no good reason at all. These weren't motivational slogans designed to sell products. These were truths earned through decades of experience, through triumph and failure, through injury and recovery, through fame and anonymity. When Dave Draper wrote about training, he wasn't writing as a champion looking down from a pedestal. He was writing as a fellow lifter, someone still in the trenches, still fighting the same battles everyone else fought. So why was Dave Draper's physique scary in the 1960s? It wasn't because he looked monstrous or freaky or unnatural. It was because he looked too advanced for his era. His density, his mass, his structural development, they all belonged to a later generation of bodybuilding. In a decade still dominated by classical lines and graceful posing, when champions like Larry Scott and Sergio Oliva were pushing boundaries but still maintaining aesthetic proportions, Draper walked on stage looking like he'd time traveled from 1975. His shoulders were bigger and rounder than anyone else's. His chest was thicker and more developed. His back had the kind of density and detail that wouldn't become standard until the Olympia competitors of the mid-70s. His arms weren't just big, they were dense, maintaining their shape even when fully relaxed. Competitors knew, instinctively, that if he ever focused his full energy on winning, if he ever truly committed to dominating the sport the way Arnold would later dominate it, he could beat anyone. His potential frightened rivals more than his actual posing, because potential is always scarier than achievement. Achievement you can see and measure and prepare for. Potential is unknown, unlimited, dangerous. He had the size, the symmetry, and the raw strength to be unstoppable. His training logs proved it. The weights he moved, the volume he handled, the systematic progression he maintained. All of it suggested someone capable of going much further than he ever did competitively. But he never chased dominance the way others did. He chased the work itself. The process, the daily ritual of showing up and lifting and growing. And that made him even more intimidating in a strange way. Because someone who doesn't need to prove themselves, someone who's content with the work regardless of external validation, that person is always more dangerous than someone desperately chasing recognition. Draper's physique whispered power instead of shouting it. It suggested depths that hadn't been fully explored. And whispers in the right silence are always louder than screams. Dave Draper's legacy isn't just about the titles he won, or the magazine covers he appeared on, or even the incredible physique he built. It's about the way he approached the iron with reverence and consistency across decades. It's about the influence he had on the people who came after him. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Frank Zane, Franco Columbu, and countless others trained alongside him at Gold's Gym in the early 1970s and learned from watching how he worked. His training philosophy shaped future generations who discovered that volume, intensity, and discipline could build anything. His writing gave modern lifters a window into the golden era mindset, a time when training was sacred and the gym was a temple and the work mattered more than the results. His humility remains unmatched in bodybuilding lore. He never sought to be remembered as the greatest champion or the most successful businessman or the most famous personality. He just wanted to be remembered as someone who loved the work, who showed up consistently, who treated the iron with respect and gratitude. He trained into his 70s despite struggling with heart issues for decades. His heart, weakened by years of intense training and the physical demands he'd placed on it during his competitive years, required careful management, but he kept lifting, adjusting his approach, training smarter instead of harder, focusing on movement and strength and the joy of physical activity rather than chasing numbers. He remained present in the Santa Cruz lifting community, offering advice to younger lifters, writing his weekly essays, living the philosophy he'd spent decades developing. When he passed away on November 30th, 2021, at age 79 from long-term heart complications, the bodybuilding world mourned not just a champion, but a teacher, a man who'd proven that strength wasn't just physical, a man who'd shown that real greatness came from consistency, discipline, and the willingness to keep showing up even when nobody was watching. So here's the answer to the question we started with, the question that's driven this entire story. Why did a quiet young man from New Jersey become one of the 1960s most feared physiques? Because his silence wasn't empty. It was full of discipline that never wavered, full of focus that couldn't be shaken, full of consistency that accumulated into something extraordinary over years and decades, full of effort that demanded nothing in return except the satisfaction of work well done. While others talked about training, Draper trained. While others posed for cameras and cultivated images, Draper worked in the dark. While others chased fame and recognition, Draper chased the next rep, the next set, the next morning in the gym when the sun hadn't risen yet. and the weight sat waiting in the quiet. His physique scared people because it proved something most competitors didn't want to accept. That greatness doesn't require noise. That power doesn't need an audience. That the strongest person in the room is often the one who never announces it, who never brags, who just shows up and does the work and lets the results speak. Dave Draper's silent discipline built a body that looked like it came from the future. But more importantly, it built a life worth living, a philosophy worth following, and a legacy that still teaches us today. The iron speaks if you listen. The body answers if you're patient. And the quiet ones, the people like Dave Draper who never sought attention but earned respect through decades of consistent effort, they're always the ones you should respect most. In a sport that eventually rewarded loud personalities and spectacle and controversy, Dave Draper proved that the most enduring strength often belongs to the person who just shows up quietly, day after day, year after year, and does the work. No shortcuts, no secrets, no theatrics, just iron effort and an unbreakable commitment to becoming better than you were yesterday.